In Walmart's Who'Knewville, everyone ready their cart. Amazing Black Friday deals are about to start. Online and in the app, such great deals to explore. Everything you love from tech, toys, and more. The days to save and the ones to remember. It's only the 25th to the 30th of November. Set your alarms. Don't miss out. These deals are epic, without a doubt. The Who's are all ready, but are you? Walmart Black Friday deals await. Who knew?
Oh, Hilton stay, your beds are soft and cozy. No lumpy couch, no stiff futon, no shower line at crack of dawn. Oh, Hilton stay.
When you want holiday comfort you can count on, it matters where you stay. Enjoy comfortable rooms and friendly service when you stay with Hilton instead. Save up to 25% this season when you book with Hilton. Hilton for the stay. Terms apply.
Little bits of intelligence being pulled together, some of it coming from the Americans, some of it coming from the British. There was other stuff, some CIA stuff, agents talking about missiles being towed along on roads in Cuba. But the point is, it isn't just one piece of intelligence. We think of people like Penkovsky, as the big boys of intelligence, but they're just part of the picture.
Welcome to the Spy Masters podcast. My name is Antonia Senior and I'm your host. Each time I interview one of the best writers in the business about intelligence and espionage. In this episode, I'm talking to the brilliant Michael Smith. After a career in military intelligence, Michael became a journalist and an author, winning awards for his reporting and becoming a bestseller for his books about intelligence. We're talking today about his new book, The Real Special Relationship, which is about the close working partnership between British and US intelligence. We'll be talking mainly about one incident which is emblematic of that relationship, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Spy Masters has got some great guests coming up, including top historian Roger Moorhouse on who knew what when about the Holocaust. We've got some crackers in the back catalogue too, including a chat with the legendary Nigel West about his lifetime in mole hunting. Don't forget to subscribe, rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Now over to me, talking to Michael Smith about the Real Special Relationship. Michael, hello, and thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. The book is an absolute tour de force. It covers the full sweep of British and American intelligence cooperation from World War II and well beyond. I'd like to take a deep dive, if we may, into the Cuban Missile Crisis and what it tells us about that particular relationship.
Well, I think the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 is the perfect example in the book of how British and American intelligence worked together. They've been working together since 1941, just before America came into the war, largely based on the work of Bletchley Park. And at the end of the war, politicians really didn't want to lose the sort of intelligence they've been getting from the American codebreakers and the British codebreakers. And they didn't want to lose intelligence at all, given that Eastern Europe was being taken over by Soviet Union, and that was the new target and had been actually for some time towards the end of the war, and certainly throughout 1945 there was a beginning of collection of intelligence on Soviet military.
Michael, could you just lay out for me, where are we in this immediate post-war period in terms of cooperation between the US and the British Secret Services as we're moving into the early stages of the Cold War? What's their relationship like?
Their relationship is pretty strong. It had built up during the war, largely based on the work of the codebreakers, and particularly the work of the British codebreakers at Bletchley Park and the American codebreakers in the Far East. And intelligence was very strong during the Second World War. I mean, it didn't win the war in a sense. Soldiers with rifles and tanks and bayonets won the war, but they were greatly aided by intelligence. And most importantly of all, the people who were in charge knew that this intelligence had been invaluable to them, and they didn't want to lose it. So as we move into the Cold War, and the Cold War begins pretty early in some senses, in intelligence senses, by the end of 1944, they are beginning to set up units to break Soviet codes and ciphers, collecting information and intelligence from the Finns and Swedes and the Estonians who had been breaking Soviet ciphers before the war, before they were taken over, of course, at the end of the Second World War. And NSA, as it later became, National Security Agency, it wasn't formed yet, but the US codebreakers would eventually become the NSA. And GCHQ, as Bletchley Park became by the end of the war, were monitoring stuff around the world. And these politicians who'd been getting all this intelligence, they really didn't want to lose it. So the special relationship in terms of intelligence continued into these post-war years and was very strong. And the British were at the time arguably the stronger of the two countries in terms of intelligence. That changed over the next decade or so because the Americans were able to put more money in it. They hadn't had an MI6 type organization before the war, so the OSS evolved slowly at first, but eventually into the CIA. And all of this intelligence is being shared, particularly so between the American codebreakers and the British codebreakers. And they'd broken most of Soviet ciphers within a couple of years of the end of the war. And we're totally on top of it. Unfortunately, there was a guy called William Weisband who was actually from the Soviet Union, actually born in Ukraine, but family had moved to America when he was a young kid, and he was a KGB agent in place inside the American Army code-breaking operation, and he gave away to the Russians all the details of everything that the British and Americans had broken. And so on Black Friday in 1948, all of the radio networks, Soviet radio networks, went down one by one. And when they started coming back up again, they were using completely different ciphers and systems. And we talk a lot about things like the Cambridge Five, Aldrich James, all of these different famous spies. But actually, I would argue that William Weisband was probably the one that did most damage, because it was several decades before GCHQ and what was then the National Security Agency, NSA, began to get back into Soviet ciphers on anything like the same scale that they had in the immediate aftermath of the war.
Right. So towards the end of the 40s then and into the early 50s, they're basically blind as to Soviet intentions, having been quite well informed. Is that pretty much?
They are. They're not entirely blind, because you can work other stuff out without knowing what's happening in the secret ciphers. From activity alone, you can work out what's going on. And obviously, they also had other ways of collecting intelligence, people on the ground, or aerial photography, which was very useful. And but yeah, you monitor the radio stations. You can work out where individual units are. You can work out what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. In East Germany, we had military units who were a hangover from the initial occupation of Germany, who were able to travel around East Germany and observe stuff that was going on. Elsewhere, you had to rely on intelligence officers traveling or spies, aerial photography, and this process of what's basically called traffic analysis, of radio signals. And of course, lower grades ciphers could be broken. NSA and GCHQ split up the world, basically. They didn't try and do the same thing. They split up the world. And the Americans, despite their anti-colonialist position, very strong anti-colonialist position, of course, there's a great deal of hypocrisy around that in Latin America, for example, but also in places like Diego Garcia, where, they see that as a site they can use. So colonialism is all right there. And they had sites around the world. Britain had sites around the world that the Americans could use. And so they were very grateful for that. Hong Kong was a big staging post into China. The US consulate was packed, literally hundreds of CIA guys in there. So they're sharing the world between them. And one of the sites, the British sites that was used for a key thing was Scarborough, GCHQ's base in Scarborough. Big intercept analysis and reporting site in Scarborough. And its main role, or one of its key roles rather, was monitoring Soviet merchant shipping. And in July 1960, it begins to pick up lots of Soviet merchant ships traveling towards Cuba, and their manifests palpably don't match up with what's being said in radio communications. Those radio communications that were open, because highly unusually, these ships were also using a sophisticated Soviet cipher to talk back to their bases in the Baltic. And their manifests just didn't match up with what they'd reported on Lloyd's List. So that was the beginning of weapons being taken to Cuba by the Soviet Union to build up what would be effectively a mini army on Cuba.
And just talk me through the Soviet position on this. Why have they decided to do this? And do they understand how much of a provocation it will be if it's discovered?
Well, they wanted to have missiles close to America. It's very simple. They wanted also to defend Cuba. In March of 1960, the Americans had sponsored an invasion by Cuban rebel forces of Cuba, the so-called Bay of Pigs disaster. It was ham-fisted and it wasn't particularly well organized, and the Americans refused to allow air support. So the rebels were just stuck on a beach getting shot at by the Cubans, and the whole thing fell apart. But that's March 1960. And in July 1960, Scarborough starts picking up this stuff, this merchant shipping, clearly carrying weapons and going to Cuba.
Michael, at this stage, as I understand it from your book, the special relationship, although it's kind of worked post-war pretty well, Kennedy, obviously, who's president in the United States at this point, is slightly less enamored of the special relationship than perhaps other presidents. This is not a priority.
It was much more the State Department and White House officials who were National Security Advisor, Secretary of State, were not very enamored of the British, didn't really care that much about it. Kennedy was more into it, frankly. He was much closer to Macmillan than people at the time, the press, were saying. And he was very keen on Macmillan. He saw Macmillan. Eisenhower had said to him when he took over, Eisenhower had briefed him entirely on the intelligence relationship and how important it was. And he'd also told him, because Eisenhower had worked with Macmillan during the Second World War, during Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa, Macmillan was actually Britain's minister to North Africa. And so Kennedy and Macmillan got on well. Kennedy saw Macmillan as a sort of an older man he could turn to for advice occasionally, and they were actually distantly related. So, Kennedy wasn't against the special relationship. He was, as Eisenhower had been, very keen to make sure that that thing that had gone on during the war, where British intelligence was more powerful in a sense than American intelligence, had to be reversed, and the Americans had to be in charge. That was Eisenhower's and Kennedy's position, as you do expect from a U.S. president. But no, he was very keen on it, and throughout the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was talking by phone to Macmillan and also to the British ambassador, who's a close friend of Kennedy's anyway from their youth.
Okay, so we've got open and receptive president. We've got Scarborough picking up this unusual maritime activity. What happens next?
Well, throughout the Cold War, Britain and America had intercept and analysis and reporting sites in West Germany, targeting East Germany, targeting Poland, targeting Czechoslovakia, and of course, particularly targeting Soviet forces in those countries. And beginning of 1961, US Air Force operators in the south of West Germany, in Bavaria, began picking up Cuban pilots being trained by Soviet pilots flying out of Czech airfields. And so the Soviets are training Cuban pilots. So that's a bit more information coming in that's sort of showing what's going on. You're only building up from very little at this point, but these things combined with Sabra are beginning to show something is really seriously going on. So the Americans, the US Navy site in Puerto Rico, built up its Cuban coverage far, far greater than it had been previously. A US Army Special Forces, Special Operations Intercept operation that had been at Fort Bragg, moved south to Florida to cover Cuba, and US Navy kitted out a special ship with intercept facilities and moored it off the Cuban coast. It sailed round Cuba, intercepting what it could, see what was there, and then was moored off the Cuban coast. And the number of reconnaissance flights by U-2 aircraft over Cuba was doubled. At the time, it was the CIA that flew U-2 aircraft, spy planes, and the CIA set up a special admissions center in Miami to debrief people coming in, the Cuban refugees coming in, and see if anyone had seen anything relevant to what was obviously the buildup of Soviet weaponry in Cuba. America had broken off diplomatic relations with Cuba at this point, by this point, sometime previously. And so the British ambassador was asked by the Americans to use his people to spy on the Cubans. And in those days, even now, frankly, British ambassadors abroad hate intelligence officers. You've probably seen the scenes in Smiley's People, when the BBC series Smiley's People, when the ambassador is furious that there's an MI6 officer doing something he doesn't know anything about on his patch. So asking the British ambassador in Cuba if he would let his people spy on the Cubans was a big deal. But the ambassador was a man called Bill Marchant, who had been the deputy head of Hut 3, the intelligence reporting team at Bletchley Park, reporting on Enigma, Army and Air Force Enigma. So he got it, and he sent his people out. And one of the next things that's being intercepted and demonstrating what's going on is the KGB telling the Cubans that the British embassy is spying on them intensively.
Did the KGB tell the Cubans that the British are spying? But
yeah.
Presumably, I mean, the Cubans know the British are spying, right? Don't they? The British are
Well,
always spying.
not from their embassy, but yeah, I suppose you're right. Yes, but it just sort of firms up in terms of the book. It's firming up the information. But I like the fact that Herbert Marchant was at Bletchley Park, so he gets the idea. Now we're getting to the missiles, because late August 1962, so we're closing in on what is the crisis, because that's in late October. Late August 1962, a CIA U-2 aircraft photographed Soviet surface-to-air missiles capable of shooting down a U-2 at 8 locations in Cuba. Well, okay, they're air defense missiles, so they're entitled to have defenses. They're not offensive weapons, they're defensive weapons. And both the White House and the CIA said, well, these are defensive weapons. They're not evidence of anything at all. NSA and GCHQ disagreed. And most importantly of all, John McCone, the new CIA director, disagreed. He was on honeymoon in the south of France, and he was seeing all this stuff, and he intervened and said, look, yes, they are defensive weapons, but they're not defending the workers in the sugar plantations, are they? They're there to defend something important, and we need to find out what that is. Then 14th of October, and now we are approaching the crisis, really, on top of it. 14th of October, 1962, a U-2 spy plane crossed Cuba, collecting nearly 1,000 images, including its main target, a suspected missile site at San Cristobal. CIA imagery analysts spent the following day struggling to work out what they were looking at. They knew they were not air defense missiles. These were Soviet surface-to-surface missiles, and a genuine threat. They didn't know what type of missile it was. They just couldn't see what type of missile it was. U-2 imagery wasn't as great as it now is, as satellite imagery is. And they didn't know, because they didn't know what type of missile it was. They didn't know how much of the United States it could hit, which was the key thing.
So we've got a combination of British and American intelligence to getting to this point where they know there's something. They need to find out what it is. Do we need to back up a bit now and talk about a certain Russian defector who is going to be quite important to the story?
Yes, we do, because Oleg Penkovsky, he during the war, he fought on the Ukrainian front, and his commander, then just a commanding officer of his unit, was wounded, and Penkovsky looked after and taken back to Moscow to be treated. And Penkovsky looked after the colonel's daughter and his wife, the colonel's wife, and he also, when a daughter from the colonel's previous marriage died, he also arranged her funeral. He sold his watch to make sure she had a nice dress to wear in her coffin. And when the colonel recovers, he is just so grateful to this guy. And he says, "You're like a son to me." And he became a mentor to him. And Penkovsky was already a member of Soviet military intelligence. And after the war, and by the early 60s, his main task is to find missile technology, data on missile technology, to improve the Soviet missile systems, because their guidance systems were very poor. And his mentor, the wartime colonel, is now a general and is in charge of all Soviet missiles systems. And so they used to meet up at the weekend, and because the general knew that Penkovsky's job was to find missile technology, he was showing him all these documents, and Penkovsky had been recruited by MI6 as an agent in place inside the GRU and was passing all this stuff on to the MI6 head of station in Moscow. He used to go out on a Sunday, and the head of station's wife would push their baby daughter along in a pram, and had a little girl with her walking along with her. And Penkovsky would come up and just drop some sweets into the pram. But the sweets, of course, were actually microfiche, a microfilm of all the documents he'd seen. And one of those documents laid out in explicit detail how surface-to-air missiles should be laid out around a surface-to-surface missile site. And for different missiles with different ranges, the layout of the surface-to-air system was different because the layout of the missiles themselves was different. And with that information, the CIA analysts trying to work out what's going on the ground realized that what they had there was medium-range surface-to-surface missiles, which could hit the whole of the southeast of the United States, from Houston in Texas right up to the main US naval base in Virginia.
What do we know about Penkovsky's motivation? Why was he passing this stuff to the British?
With new, gentler scented Clorox disinfecting wipes, clean finally smells as good as it feels. On everything from lamps to ceiling fans. Even on your kid's toy shark. Oh, ouch. Clorox disinfecting wipes, now available in crisp lemon. Find it on Amazon. Clorox, clean feels good.
Meet the computer you can talk to. With Copilot on Windows, working, creating, and collaborating is as easy as talking. Got writer's block? Share your screen with Copilot Vision to help spark inspiration, and use Copilot Voice to have a conversation and brainstorm ideas. Or maybe you need some tech help. With Copilot Vision, Copilot sees what you see. Let Copilot talk you through step-by-step guidance so you can master new apps, games, and skills faster. Try now at windows.com/Copilot.
His motivation was generally one of dislike of the Soviet Union, unhappiness with the way things were, and a belief that the West was better. And he had the bizarre sort of desire to meet Kennedy and to meet Macmillan, and to wear British uniform and to wear American uniform, and to be a soldier for the West inside the Soviet Union.
The information he supplied, they now know, or the CIA have now worked out, that the Soviets have the technology to hit Houston and beyond. What happens then?
Well, what happens then is that they get another set of photographs, and they show an even more lethal missile, the intermediate range Soviet SS-5 surface-to-surface missile, which is capable of hitting the majority of mainland America, including Washington. And Kennedy... So
just to be clear, before these missiles are stationed in Cuba, there is no Russian capability to hit the United States itself. They don't have the technology at this point to do that without
to be certain of hitting it. No, because of the missile guidance systems problem. But yeah, they did have long range surface to surface missiles that could have hit United States, but not with the sort of accuracy at this stage that planting stuff on Cuba would give them.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And at this point, obviously, Kennedy realizes he has to do something.
Do we have any inside knowledge of Kennedy being told how his reaction, or was it a shock? What do we know about that?
Yeah, it was a shock. Yeah. When the CIA told Robert Kennedy first, because although Robert Kennedy was technically Justice Secretary, he was also the conduit to his brother, and they obviously in this situation are talking very closely to each other. And Robert and John F. Kennedy and the British ambassador are having meetings virtually every night over dinner and discussing it. And when the CIA told Robert Kennedy why they needed to speak to the president about the missiles, and told him that they've got SS-5 surface-to-surface missiles that could hit virtually the whole of the United States, his initial response was a four-letter word, beginning with S, not F, but yeah.
Oh, yeah. Either would have covered it, I think.
Yeah. So Kennedy wrote to Khrushchev, warning him the missiles must be removed. He spoke to Macmillan first, discussed it with him. He then addressed the American people that evening, repeated his demands that the missiles must be removed, and announced a US blockade of Cuba. No Soviet shipping would be allowed through.
I'm quite interested that he addressed the American people so early in the crisis. What was the point, do you think, of going so public? Why did the American people need to know that there were missiles trained at their homes?
Well, I think by ramping it up, you put more pressure on Khrushchev. You make it clear how you are not going to tolerate this, and you are telling not just the American people, of course, but the whole world that this is not going to happen. You're going to remove those missiles, and you will back down, and we're going to blockade Cuba, and you won't be able to get ships in. And early the next morning, Scarborough picked up messages. Well, they actually picked up the locations of Soviet merchant ships which had been closing on Cuba, suddenly turning around and going back on their routes. And so the ships were beginning to turn around. Having said that, not all the ships were turning around, and Khrushchev responded very, very aggressively to the announcement of the blockade and threatened to attack any US ship that tried to stop any Soviet ship docking in Cuba. But because of what Penkovsky knew, because of the fact he knew they didn't have the guidance technology to do something against America, or America was in a stronger position in terms of nuclear missiles, and they didn't have the armory in terms of missiles, Kennedy knew he was in a stronger position. Penkovsky had said to his MI6 handlers, Kennedy should be firm. Khrushchev is not going to fire the rockets. He's not ready for war. And so Kennedy is able to behave in a calm way, knowing that he has time, and it's the time that matters. And he insists all Soviet ships carrying military cargo to Cuba would be stopped, and Khrushchev must order all those missiles already on the island to be removed. At this point, we get another British intelligence asset coming in, and it's going to sound odd. It's the BBC monitoring service, which was then based at Caversham Park, north of Reading, 50 miles west of London. And in a huge 18th century building, wonderful building. The building's still there. Sadly, BBC monitoring is not. It's a much reduced presence, thanks to George Osborne cutting funding and forcing the BBC to fund it. So you cut one of our major intelligence sources. It was tied, just like GCHQ was tied to NSA, and by this stage, NSA and GCHQ are like Siamese twins. It's tied to the CIA's Foreign Broadcast Information Service, which monitors radio stations and telecommunications around the world. BBC did exactly the same thing. But again, like GCHQ and NSA, they split the world up between them. So the BBC had the main responsibility for the Soviet Union Moscow radio on the western side of the Soviet Union. And shortly after 10 o'clock in the morning, Washington time, on Saturday, 27th of October, Moscow radio began broadcasting a letter to Kennedy from Khrushchev. And Russian monitors are working in line. It's obviously pre-computer, so they're all sat there at Olivetti's or whatever, or even older things, because monitoring had started during the Second World War and was equipped with pretty much Second World War equipment at this stage. And they're sat there typing, and in a line, the monitors in a line, 6 monitors sat there. One types one small section, the first small section of the letter is taken off by a secretary, put in a Lamson tube up to the CIA office on the first floor, because the Foreign Broadcast Information Service had their London office on the first floor at Caversham Park. And from there, it's teleprinted to the White House Situation Room, direct to the White House Situation Room, where someone rips it off and puts it in front of Kennedy. And that these monitors are working like a relay team. So the minute those first 3 sentences are done, the next monitor is typing up the next 3 sentences, and so on. And basically, Khrushchev made a firm offer. If America withdrew its missiles, its nuclear missiles from Turkey, and pledged never to invade Cuba or to allow its territory to be used to invade Cuba, the Soviet Union would withdraw the missiles from Cuba and make a similar undertaking not to invade Turkey. Now, Bobby Kennedy, as I said earlier, the strong man, really, he's a hard man to Kennedy's more tactile, friendly guy. Bobby Kennedy called in the Soviet ambassador and told him America would not be pressured into a deal by the Soviet Union. But his brother had decided some time ago that he wanted to withdraw the missiles anyway. And if the crisis came to an end, they would soon be gone. So we're having this little game of who's the tough guy here. The Americans are giving the Russians something, but they're not going to let it look like they've lost. They want it to look like the Soviet Union has stepped down.
But they also understand, don't they, that the Soviets need something to save some face. They can't just back down entirely. There has to be some,
yes.
I mean, that was
exactly
the genius of
that.
Kennedy's
Exactly
acceptance,
that.
right?
It is. It's exactly that. But Robert Kennedy's doing it in a way that doesn't look like the Americans are backing down. And the following day, Sunday, 28th of October, 9:04 in the morning, and Kennedy, obviously Catholic family, just as Kennedy and his family are getting ready for church, Moscow radio begins broadcasting Khrushchev's response. And the same thing happened as the day before. The first flash signal from the CIA offices in Caversham Park arrived in the White House Situation Room a few minutes later, followed by small sections of the Soviet leader's address as they were typed up by the monitors and pushed through by the CIA office to the Situation Room teleprinters. And the key passage is half a dozen sections down in the Soviet leader's address. And he says, given the US assurance that it would not invade Cuba or allow its territory to be used to invade Cuba, the Soviet government has given a new order to dismantle the arms which you described as offensive and to crate and return them to the Soviet Union. And so the crisis is now at an end. And I think the thing about that, and the point I was trying to make about it all, is that the British, through MI6, you through Caversham, and through stuff that GCHQ is intercepting at Scarborough, have pushed in a lot of different bits of the intelligence picture. And the intelligence picture is always like a jigsaw. You always remember where we started off with Scarborough and those ships with wonky manifests clearly carrying weapons, and the Soviet pilots training Cuban pilots in Czechoslovakia. Little bits of intelligence being pulled together, some of it coming from the Americans, some of it coming from the British. There was other stuff, some CIA stuff, agents talking about missiles being towed along on roads in Cuba. But the point is, it isn't just one piece of intelligence. We think of people like Penkovsky, as the big boys of intelligence, but they're just part of the picture.
The other part of the intelligence picture, though, is the fact that intelligence is only as good as the person using that intelligence, right? So this picture is built up and it goes up to Kennedy, but he's still the one having to make decisions on the basis of that intelligence. And that's, some people use intelligence very badly and some people use it well. And it seemed to have worked for him.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing when we're talking about Macmillan and Kennedy is, for all of the special relationship at the surface, president to prime minister, country to country, and it ebbs and flows dreadfully. And very often you know that both sides are saying it rather than thinking it means much. Behind the scenes, if the president and the British prime minister, the US president and the British prime minister, are getting exactly the same intelligence, then given that they have we as countries have very similar worldviews. I know, we laugh at the Americans and they laugh at us, but we do have very similar worldviews about democracy, freedom of the individual, the capitalist system, I suppose. And if they're getting the same intelligence and they think in the same way and they have the same outlook on the world, then they are going to act in tandem far more than any other ally will do. And that's really what I'm trying to get over in the book, the basis of the special relationship. Because, I mean, they're minor things, but if you look at the way we reacted to Tehran's attack on Israel, the Houthis jointly acting together, RAF not only taking part, but actually replacing American aircraft in Syria, overflying Syria, working in complete and utter tandem with the Americans. Now, some people will say that's a bad thing. I personally think it's a good thing in general. And at times, we can all have feelings that maybe we shouldn't be doing something the Americans are doing. And, Iraq is probably the most notable one of that. But you've only got to look at the way when Russia was about to attack Ukraine, France and West Germany were saying, no, it's not. No, it's just all overheated. CIA intelligence, NSA intelligence, GCHQ intelligence, MI6 intelligence was being passed out and briefed out by the British and the Americans to demonstrate that Russia was going to attack. That sort of jointry and knowledge is, you can't beat that sort of capability.
That I did find very interesting though, because it seems to be a new thing. It's happening more, that the intelligence itself is being made public, or some of it, obviously without sources. Whereas, back in, I guess, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the intelligence itself was not made public. What was made public was, the kind of the situation post the intelligence. We know this is happening, but they wouldn't have dreamt of saying how they knew it was happening. So that special relationship has come out of the shadows a little bit, hasn't it?
It has, very much so. And even for the British, with the official history of GCHQ being published. And they were able to publish that because in order to do some of the things they had to do, the bill that authorized them to do it had to detail how things would happen in a way that didn't give secrets, obviously, about what they knew or what they were looking at precisely, but tells you that actually GCHQ do this sort of stuff, where previously, at the end of the war, you weren't even allowed to mention the fact that Britain was breaking codes. It wasn't allowed. I remember when I went into that side of the world in the army, in military intelligence, they put this word up on the blackboard, SIGINT, which is short for signals intelligence. And we were told that word is classified. You must never use it outside. Now, people like me write about all this stuff. John Scarlett wrote the introduction to my book, and a former NSA director and CIA director wrote the introduction in the US book. I mean, people are much more open about it, and you can be open about it as long as you protect the source. And as long as the Russians didn't know what the source was, or the source was so obviously monitored anyway, they would have worked out what it was. You can do that. And obviously, traffic analysis, which you can't stop happening, really. Traffic analysis would have been a huge part of all that, but there was lots of detail there. And I thought myself, my God, are you sure you're not giving something away here? But they know what they're doing. It was the CIA director, Bill Burns, who was doing it.
In terms of protecting your sources, can you just finish the story of Oleg Penkovsky? What happened to him?
I'm afraid Oleg Penkovsky was already, by the time that the crisis was resolved, had been spotted, and they knew he'd been doing stuff, and he was shot. Yeah.
Can I just ask a counterfactual as well? Without the intelligence, what do you think everything would have looked like? Presumably, we would have been in a situation where all those missile emplacements were then kind of set up and ready to go, and then but presumably at some point, I don't know what happens. I mean, they don't fire them, but they certainly tell the Americans it's a fait accompli, and then it's too late. I don't know. What does it look like without the intelligence?
Well, it looks a lot more difficult. It would be very difficult to see how you got rid of them all. I'm not sure, because we went through a period, and let's be honest, the Russians did have very good, capable intercontinental ballistic missiles, which could have taken America out. No one tried to. And, the context is everything. We had seen the Bay of Pigs attempted invasion, and it's not until that takes place that any of this begins to take place. So the Russians didn't attack America. America didn't attack Russia. And I don't think either side would have wanted to do it. We never reached a point where it ever looked really likely. The only point at which it did look really likely was the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Michael, thank you for taking us through the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was completely fabulous. And I urge everybody to run out and buy your book, because it is an absolutely fantastic overview of an extraordinary intelligence partnership. It was seeing it all like that, I think, was kind of mind-blowing to me. I hadn't really appreciated, I think, the depth of the cooperation. So thanks for the book, and thanks for coming on.
It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Spy Masters podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss an episode. Come in from the cold with Spy Masters.